Willowbrook is a small town nestled among the lush green forests of Maine, with just a few hundred residents. It is known for its peaceful atmosphere, traditional wooden houses, and cobblestone streets. The people here are all familiar with one another, and life unfolds at a slow pace, like a gentle melody. Among the families living in Willowbrook, the Thompson family stands out for its warmth and close-knit bond. John Thompson is a carpenter who always spends his free time crafting wooden items for his family and friends. He has sun-kissed skin and calloused hands, signs of a diligent worker. His wife, Emma, is a gentle and caring woman who lovingly tends to their home and their 4 children with boundless affection. Their 4 children, each with their own unique personalities, always bring liveliness to the little wooden house. Each evening, when the warm golden lights illuminate the space, the sound of the children's laughter echoes, making the house more vibrant than ever. Annie, the eldest at 12 years old, is a smart and strong girl. She is always the one to lead and protect her younger siblings. Timmy, 10, is an energetic boy who loves exploring and seeking new adventures. The twin girls, Lily and Lucy, are only 6, but their sweetness and innocence never fail to melt the hearts of those around them. On a bright June afternoon, as the sun sets on the horizon, casting warm golden hues, John decides to host a backyard barbecue for family and friends. He invites the neighborhood parents, along with their children, to join in the festivities. Everyone is excited, and laughter fills the garden behind the house. "Dad, I want to help," Timmy shouted, running toward John with bright, shining eyes. "All right, Timmy, you can help me grill the meat," John replied, smiling. He set up a tall chair for his son so he could stand and join in the grilling. As everything was ready, the laughter and chatter of everyone blended into a joyful symphony. Emma busily prepared the salad and bread while the children ran around the garden, searching for butterflies and wildflowers. The fresh, cool air of the summer afternoon made everyone feel relaxed and happy. After the barbecue ended, Emma suggested that the children set up a little camping adventure in the yard. The kids were instantly excited. They dashed into the house, dragging out an old tent the family had used on previous camping trips. "We'll tell ghost stories," Annie said, her eyes sparkling. "I'll tell the story of a ghost that lives in the woods." "Ghosts? I don't want to hear ghost stories," Timmy protested, but he couldn't hide his curiosity. Finally, after the tent was set up, everyone gathered inside. The children huddled close together, the light from a flashlight illuminating their innocent faces, while John and Emma stood outside, listening to the laughter and soft chatter coming from within the tent. After a while, the light began to dim, and everyone started to drift off to sleep. As the atmosphere grew quiet, John turned to Emma, and they discussed their children's future. "They'll grow up quickly," Emma said solemnly. "We need to prepare them with valuable life lessons." "That's true," John agreed. "But let's allow them to enjoy their childhood for now. Life will bring its own challenges." As night fell, a gentle breeze swept through, carrying the scent of grass and damp earth. Willowbrook sank into a deep sleep, but in that tranquil space, no one knew that a storm was silently approaching. The night passed peacefully until the faint light of dawn began to emerge. The birds started to chirp, and the sky gradually brightened, but there were no sounds from the Thompson family's home. Everything remained still, like a painting. A sense of unease began to creep into Mrs. Ruth, a kind neighbor living nearby. She had a habit of looking through the Thompsons' window every morning to see if the family members were awake. But today, there were no signs of life. She stood up, feeling anxious, and decided to walk over to check. When she reached the front door, she knocked gently. "John, Emma, are you there?" but no one answered. Feeling that something was amiss, she decided to step inside, hoping to find everyone in their usual state. The door opened easily, and she walked in. The air in the house felt cold and still, in stark contrast to the usual warmth. Weak sunlight filtered in, but it wasn't enough to dispel the pervasive chill. "John, Emma," Mrs. Ruth called, her heart filled with worry. As she walked through the living room, she noticed the chairs were still neatly arranged, showing no signs of a recent gathering. Everything seemed frozen in time. She moved into the kitchen, and when she saw the untidy table, a shiver ran down her spine. Maybe they went out, she told herself, but when she entered John and Emma's bedroom, that feeling turned into a terrifying reality. Sunlight streamed in, but there was no one in that darkened room. A stifling silence enveloped the house, and Mrs. Ruth's anxiety heightened. She felt as if she were in a horror movie, where everything was out of the ordinary. She decided to check each room, and as she stepped into the children's room, things became even stranger. Everything remained silent. Not a sound could be heard, and there was no one in the house. Her worry had transformed into fear. She quickly turned round and ran to the nearest neighbor's house to seek help. Everyone needed to know that something was wrong at the Thompson home. As Mrs. Ruth rushed away, life in Willowbrook was about to turn a page. A chapter filled with unanswered questions and mysteries that no one could possibly imagine. Early in the morning, after Mrs. Ruth ran to her neighbor's house and informed others about the strange silence at the Thompson home, a group of people gathered at the house. Worries spread through every gaze as they began asking each other questions that no one could answer. "Maybe they've gone out," one neighbor suggested, but the unease in his voice was evident. "I often see them outside in the morning." "Everyone, let's go inside and check," Mrs. Ruth urged, her impatience rising. "We can't just stand here and wait." The neighbors nodded, and together they stepped into the house. As they crossed the threshold, a chill enveloped them once more. The air inside remained still, with not a sound echoing. Sunlight streamed through the windows, but it seemed unable to dispel the heaviness in the atmosphere. They split up, each taking a different direction to search. Mrs. Ruth felt a thrill of anxiety as she entered the living room. The chairs and table were still neatly arranged, as if everything were fine. She decided to head into the kitchen, where delicious breakfast aromas usually wafted. Upon entering the kitchen, a strange sight greeted her. The table was still set with various dishes, but there were no signs of anyone having eaten. She looked around, feeling as if she were standing in a film depicting a life abandoned. Everything was just as it was, but the absence of the Thompson family made the space feel cold. Meanwhile, John, another neighbor, had gone upstairs to check the rooms. He walked cautiously, hearing his footsteps echo in the hallway. "John, Emma," he called out, but only silence answered him. As he opened each door, the strange feeling intensified. When John entered Annie's bedroom, he noticed the bed was still neatly made. What unsettled him was the eerie silence. Annie usually couldn't sleep well without the glow of her nightlight. He turned back to the hallway, feeling as though something was watching him. Outside, the neighbors began to gather again. The anxiety among them was growing. "Maybe we should call the police," one suggested. "This isn't normal at all." Finally, as some of the neighbors went outside to call the police, Mrs. Ruth decided to go back in and check the interior of the house once more. She walked into Timmy and Lily's room, while the children were still sound asleep in the tent outside. No one was inside the house. However, a small shoe lay abandoned beside the bed, appearing to have been dropped during the night. Mrs. Ruth's unease intensified. She stepped outside and saw the neighbors huddled together, exchanging worried and suspicious glances. "We have to do something," she exclaimed. "We can't just stand here and wait." When the police finally arrived, they immediately began their investigation. A young officer named Officer Blake led the inquiry. "Please tell us everything you know about the Thompson family," he requested. The neighbors started sharing stories about the family's daily life, fond memories, and neighborhood gatherings. Officer Blake listened carefully, jotting down every piece of information they provided. "Did anyone see them leave the house?" he asked. Everyone shook their heads. "We saw them happily together last night. There were no signs of trouble." Officer Blake decided to enter the house for a closer inspection. As he stepped inside, the strange feeling enveloped him once more. "Is there anything unusual here?" he wondered, scanning the surroundings with a keen eye. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As Officer Blake continued his investigation, he noticed that the items in the house were undisturbed. Everything was in its place, yet the silence in the home felt eerie. He decided to check each room, and when he reached the bathroom, he found the window slightly ajar. Perhaps someone left through here, he thought. Outside, as the crowd grew increasingly bewildered, Officer Blake chose to ask the neighbors if anyone had seen strangers near the Thompson house. "There was a stranger I saw passing by here last night," a woman said, her eyes filled with confusion. "But I didn't think it was related." Her words heightened the anxiety among the others. Officer Blake realized that suspicion was beginning to spread among the neighbors, and a sense of panic could escalate if left unchecked. "Everyone, please remain calm," Officer Blake spoke up. "We can't let this confusion worsen the situation. We need to stay composed and seek answers." But even in his confident tone, the group still felt a lingering unease. As everyone exchanged information, a middle-aged man with a rugged appearance stepped forward. "I'm Mr. Smith, a friend of the Thompson family. I live not far from here," he said. "I had a conversation with John last night, and he seemed off." "A conversation?" Officer Blake asked, his brow furrowing in skepticism. "Can you tell us what it was about?" "We discussed some issues in his life," Mr. Smith replied. "He seemed worried about something, but didn't elaborate. It could have been work-related or something else. I tried to reassure him, but he just laughed and said everything would be fine." "Did anyone else here notice anything unusual?" Officer Blake inquired, scanning the crowd. Everyone shook their heads, their faces still puzzled. Officer Blake decided to return to the house to continue the investigation. He had requested a few colleagues to assist with the search and analyze any clues. The neighborhood began to disperse, but no one wanted to leave. They felt their safety was under threat. As night fell, Officer Blake realized it might be necessary to search the areas surrounding Willowbrook. "We should check the nearby woods," he said to his colleagues. The Thompson family often took their kids on picnics in the forest. The officers quickly prepared and made their way toward the woods. The atmosphere grew heavier, each crunch of leaves underfoot creating an eerie sound. They began calling out the names of the Thompson family members, but there was no response. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ruth returned home, her heart weighed down with worry. What happened to them, she wondered, unable to shake the image of the happy, warm Thompson family from her mind. She felt compelled to do something. She couldn't just sit still. As darkness enveloped Willowbrook, the hooting of owls echoed in the air, making everything feel more sinister. Mrs. Ruth decided to return to the Thompson home, even though she knew no one was there. When she arrived, the beams from the officers' flashlights still illuminated the area, casting strange shadows on the ground. "Mrs. Ruth, you shouldn't be here alone," an officer said upon seeing her, but she couldn't stop herself from going inside. She walked straight into the kitchen, where she had seen the unfinished meal. But what terrified her was the appearance of an object. On the dining table lay a small painting of the Thompson family. However, the painting seemed to have been altered, with their faces twisted and grotesque, as if someone had deliberately ruined it. "This can't be," Mrs. Ruth exclaimed, her heart racing. "Someone is playing tricks on us." She glanced around, feeling as if unseen eyes were watching her from the darkness. "We need to call for more help," she whispered. "We can't let this go on." Stepping out of the house, she felt as though the tranquility had been replaced by an unsettling mystery. In her heart, she sensed that her anxiety had morphed into an inescapable reality. Tension and confusion spread throughout Willowbrook, with everyone murmuring about the Thompson family. A palpable worry hung in the air, and no one dared to voice their fears. The peaceful life they once knew had vanished, leaving behind an unnamed presence that loomed over them all. Officer Blake returned, continuing the search with his colleagues. "We can't give up," he insisted. "This family has to be somewhere." The officers worked tirelessly, but with each passing hour, the weight of uncertainty stretched into a long shadow, heightening the tense atmosphere. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ruth couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring into the darkness outside. Memories of the Thompson family flooded her mind, and a profound emptiness settled within her as she thought of them. A new fear began to stir in her heart, with something supernatural lurking in the shadows. Determined to uncover more about the house's past, she resolved to ask the elders in town the next day. They might know details she had never heard. She vowed not to let this anxiety disturb her any longer. But as she closed the door, the wind howled through the cracks, producing a sound that resembled whispering. A chill ran down her spine, yet she knew she couldn't surrender to her fears. She had to uncover the truth, no matter what it entailed. The next morning, warm sunlight filtered through the window, but the atmosphere in Willowbrook remained suffocating. Most people had not slept well the previous night. Their minds were haunted by the mysterious disappearance of the Thompson family. Mrs. Ruth woke up earlier than usual, determined to uncover the reasons behind this incident. She decided to visit Mr. Green, an elderly man living in a small wooden house on the outskirts of town. Mr. Green was one of the first settlers in Willowbrook, and was a treasure trove of old stories. She had heard many people say that he knew a lot about the town's history, and perhaps he would have some information about the Thompson family's house. When she arrived at Mr. Green's house, she found him sitting on the porch, admiring his small garden. He looked tired, but when he saw her, he smiled. "Mrs. Ruth, what's going on this time?" he asked, his voice deep and warm. "Hello, Mr. Green," Mrs. Ruth replied. "I wanted to ask you about the Thompson family. They have disappeared mysteriously, and we feel that something is not right." Mr. Green paused, his expression becoming serious. "It's unfortunate. I've heard many stories about them, but I never thought something like this would happen." He paused for a moment and continued. "That house has a strange past. Before the Thompson family moved in, it was the home of another family that also faced many misfortunes." "Do you know anything about them?" Mrs. Ruth asked, feeling a growing sense of excitement. "The previous owner was a man named Charles, and his wife was Helen. They lived there for nearly 10 years. During that time, strange things happened. Some people said they heard the cries of a baby coming from the house, even though no one lived with them," Mr. Green said, his eyes shining with fear. "Is that true?" Mrs. Ruth wondered. "So what happened to them?" "No one knows for sure. One day, they suddenly left. leaving everything behind. I went to see the house after they left, and strangely, everything was intact, with no signs of having been cleaned up. A strange feeling permeated the space, Mr. Green sighed. Mrs. Ruth listened, feeling her fear intensify. But there's no reason for them to leave without explanation. Did anyone in town ever meet them? Perhaps a few of the older residents saw them, but as time passes, memories fade, Mr. Green said. However, what's strange is that after they left, some people who lived nearby also began to feel anxious and uncomfortable. Mrs. Ruth felt a pang in her heart. Do you think the Thompson family is experiencing something similar? She asked. Maybe, Mr. Green replied. But I can't be certain. This world sometimes holds many mysteries that we can't explain. After her conversation with Mr. Green, Mrs. Ruth returned home, her mind heavy with thoughts. She decided to dig deeper into the history of the previous family that lived in that house. Perhaps this was the missing piece she needed to explain the strange disappearance. She began searching for information in the town's small library. It was an old building with dusty walls, housing many valuable documents about the history of Willowbrook. As she entered, a cold and silent atmosphere enveloped her. She approached a librarian, an elderly woman with grey hair named Margaret. Hello, I'd like to learn about the history of the house that the Thompson family is living in, Mrs. Ruth said. Margaret looked up, her expression suddenly serious. That house has a dark history, she said, quietly leading her to a secluded corner of the library where old documents were stored. Do you know anything about the previous family that lived there? Mrs. Ruth asked. Yes, Margaret sighed. They encountered a lot of misfortune. Before they left, they sought help from those around them. Some said they felt they were being watched, and strange phenomena occurred in the house. Is there anything specific? Mrs. Ruth pressed. Margaret searched for a thick book and opened it for her to see. This is a record from people who lived nearby. Many reported strange noises, unusual lights, and a feeling that someone was watching them. Some even claimed to have seen shadowy figures inside the house at night. Mrs. Ruth felt uneasy. What happened to them? No one knows. They simply vanished. After that, the house remained abandoned for a long time until the Thompson family moved in, Margaret explained. But even when the new family arrived, strange stories continued. Some people claimed to have seen the silhouette of a woman standing at the window, but when they approached, no one was there. Margaret's account sent shivers down Mrs. Ruth's spine. These inexplicable stories began to make her worry about the safety of the Thompson family. She decided that she needed to do something to help them. Do you know anyone who could help find them? Mrs. Ruth asked. There's a woman who lives at the end of town. She often knows a lot about strange occurrences in this area, Margaret replied. She's a fortune teller, and many believe she has the ability to see things that others cannot. Mrs. Ruth felt it was worth a try, and perhaps she could find a clue to help the Thompson family. After thanking Margaret, she quickly made her way to where the fortune teller lived. When she arrived, she saw a small house adorned with strange symbols. A thrill spread through her heart. When she knocked on the door, a middle-aged woman with long hair and pale skin opened it. Hello, I'm Clara. What can I do for you? Hello, Mrs. Ruth said, her heart still heavy. I want to ask about the Thompson family. They have disappeared, and I feel that something is not right. Ah, that family, Clara said, her gaze deepening. They came here once. They felt that something dark was surrounding their home. They asked me if I could help them. Can you see anything? Mrs. Ruth asked, worried. Sometimes I can sense the energies around me, Clara replied. I felt a dark shadow haunting that place. They are not the first to encounter this. It has happened many times before. Can you help me find them? Mrs. Ruth pleaded. I can try, Clara replied, but I need an item related to them. It could be a photo, an object, or anything that carries their energy. Mrs. Ruth rummaged through her handbag and found the photo of the Thompson family that she had taken at Timmy's birthday party. She handed the photo to Clara, her heart heavy with hope. Clara sat down at a round table and placed the photo in the center. She closed her eyes, and the atmosphere around began to change. Let me feel, she whispered. Mrs. Ruth sat quietly, feeling as if time was passing slowly. Suddenly, Clara opened her eyes and said, There is a presence. It is very powerful. I feel fear, but also resilience. They are somewhere nearby. Mrs. Ruth felt a surge of hope in her heart. What do we need to do to find them? She asked. We need to go back to the house and investigate further, Clara said. There may be a way to communicate with them. Thank you. I will follow your advice, Mrs. Ruth said. I won't give up. As she returned home, her mind was filled with new ideas and hopes. She couldn't let fear stop her. The Thompson family needed her, and she would do everything she could to find them. Mrs. Ruth woke up with an unusual sense of urgency. The night before, her dreams were filled with images of the Thompson family and the strange signs she had heard from Mr. Green and Clara. She knew she needed to act immediately. She could not hesitate any longer. They were in danger, and she had a responsibility to find them. After a hasty breakfast, she decided to return to the Thompson family's house, a place she now felt was both familiar and shrouded in mystery. Despite the heavy atmosphere, Mrs. Ruth felt an inner strength urging her forward. When she arrived, she stood before the two-story house, its white walls faded with time, and the large windows carrying traces of accumulated dirt. She felt a chill surrounding her, as if the house was waiting for something. Taking a deep breath, she was determined not to let fear take control. She stepped inside, the wooden door creaking as if resisting her intrusion. The smell of mildew and heavy air filled the space. She carefully moved through the living room, where the furniture remained intact but covered in dust, as if time had stopped. She tried to focus, recalling what Clara had said about searching for signs of a presence. Maybe I should start upstairs, she told herself. She ascended the staircase, each step creaking loudly, echoing in the silent space. The upper floor was spacious, containing several bedrooms, and she began searching each room. The first room was the master bedroom. A large bed with a worn white bedspread sat in the center, and the wall paintings depicted images of a happy family. But as she looked closer, she noticed that their eyes seemed strange, as if they were staring at her with a sense of emptiness. That's strange, she whispered, feeling a chill run down her spine. She skimmed through the shelves, hoping to find something related to the family. Suddenly, a small box on the desk caught her attention. She opened it and found old letters inside, all seeming to contain deep thoughts and worries. Carefully, she took out one of the letters. It was from Helen to a friend. In the letter, she wrote about her fears regarding the house, the feeling that someone was watching them, and the strange dreams they often had. It feels like this house is no longer ours. Sometimes, I hear whispers from the walls, and the flickering lights make me anxious, Mrs. Ruth read silently. These words seemed to penetrate her heart, stirring up her concern for the Thompson family. The subsequent letters also contained similar emotions. She felt as though she was reading a premonition of the Thompson family's future, and a sense of urgency ignited within her. She needed to learn more. She continued to search, but the letters seemed to be all she found in this room. Exiting the master bedroom, she stepped into a small room next door. This was Timmy's room, the one she had imagined filled with toys and colorful pictures. But as she entered, she found everything had become dark and cold. Toys were scattered across the floor, and the air was heavy, as if something was suffocating the space. "Timmy," she called softly, but her voice echoed only in the silence. She looked around, searching for any signs that might lead her to the Thompson family. Suddenly, a small noise from the corner of the room caught her attention. She turned and saw a small door leading into a dark space. She felt both anxious and curious. Without hesitation, she approached the door and opened it. A chill swept out from within, causing her to shiver. In the cramped space, she saw a staircase leading down to the basement. A dim light flickered from a bulb illuminating the area below. Maybe the family came down here once, she thought, her heart racing with excitement. She carefully descended each step of the staircase, the light from the lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. When she reached the bottom, the air became even more suffocating. A dark space with storage bins and old bookshelves unfolded before her eyes. "Maybe I'll find something," she whispered to herself, starting to explore the objects around her. A strong, musty smell filled the air, but she tried not to let it deter her. As she examined the bins, she suddenly spotted an intricately carved wooden box. She opened the box to find shimmering objects inside: a necklace, several photographs, and a small mirror. But what caught her attention the most was an old diary. She gently flipped it open, each page seeming to await its story to be told. The diary belonged to Helen. The handwritten lines came to life like vivid memories, reflecting the anxieties and fears she had experienced. She wrote about feelings of loneliness and the strangeness that the house brought. Each page was filled with emotion, and Ruth felt as if she was stepping into the world of a woman trapped in fear. "We tried to keep everything stable, but that presence wouldn't let us live peacefully. There were nights when I heard Timmy's laughter, but when I checked, it was just emptiness." One of the written lines pierced Ruth's heart. She sat down on the floor, feeling a heavy weight enveloping her. Why had this house become a nightmare for this family? Unanswered questions swirled in her mind. She felt the need to learn more about what had happened in the past. "Maybe I need to talk to others," she told herself. "There might be someone in town who saw them." She stood up, placed the diary in her bag, and left the basement. As she returned to the main floor, a strong sense of anxiety arose. It felt as if someone was watching her from the shadows, making her feel tense. Stepping out of the house, she took a deep breath, but the air still felt heavy. She decided to go back and gather information from others in town. They needed to know about the strange presence in the house. As she returned to town, a cold wind blew through, carrying strange sounds. The falling leaves rustled along the road, creating a sound reminiscent of whispers. She felt as if something was waiting for her, and she was determined not to let fear take over. She started at Margaret's house, the librarian she had met the day before. When she arrived, she knocked on the door, and Margaret opened it, her face clearly showing concern. "Hello, Ruth. Is something wrong?" Margaret asked. "I found some information about the Thompson family. They have faced many strange occurrences in their house," Ruth said, feeling as if a heavy stone weighed on her heart. Margaret invited her inside, and Ruth told her about the letters and the diary she had found. Margaret listened attentively, nodding occasionally to show her sympathy. "That's strange. I've heard many stories about that house," Margaret said. "It seems like an unusual place. I've met some people who claimed to have sensed a presence in the house. Is there anyone alive who can tell us more about what happened?" Ruth asked, her heart filled with hope. Maybe Mr. Jackson, he lives nearby. He's been in this area for a long time and knows a lot about the history of the house, Margaret replied. Ruth thanked Margaret and set off to find Mr. Jackson. As she left Margaret's house, the sky began to darken, and she felt a heaviness in her heart. The questions lingered, but she knew she couldn't give up. The Thompson family needed her, and she would seek the truth. She walked through the empty streets, the streetlights flickering like faint beacons in the dark night. When she arrived at Mr. Jackson's house, she knocked on the door. An elderly man with a wrinkled face opened it. "Hello, I'm Ruth. I'd like to ask you about the Thompson family," she said, feeling a rush of nervousness. Mr. Jackson looked at her for a moment before inviting her in. In the cozy home, Mr. Jackson sat down and listened as she recounted her story. The Thompson family. They've run into serious trouble. That house has a very dark history, Mr. Jackson said, his eyes lighting up with sadness. "Do you know what happened?" Ruth asked, hoping for valuable information. "That house used to belong to another family. They went through strange occurrences and eventually had to leave. There are many rumors that the house is haunted, and those who live there often feel watched," Mr. Jackson recounted. Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. These stories seemed to align with what she had discovered. "So do you know how to help the Thompson family?" she inquired. "Maybe, but you need to be careful. These things are not a joke. There could be forces at play that you can't understand," Mr. Jackson replied, his expression serious. Ruth felt the weight of his words, but she couldn't give up. "I will do whatever it takes." "They need me," she asserted. "All right, if you really want to help them, you need to learn more about what happened before. There's a way to communicate with lost souls, but it's very dangerous," Mr. Jackson said. Ruth felt a turmoil in her heart, but her determination was stronger than her fear. She would do anything to save the Thompson family. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson," she said, leaving his house, feeling as though a new flame had been ignited in her soul. As she stepped outside, the streetlights flickered in the darkness. The stars twinkled in the sky, like beacons of hope for what she was about to face. She knew her journey was just beginning, and the Thompson family needed her more than ever. Ruth returned home with a complex mood. The information from Mr. Jackson had opened a new door for her, but also made her feel more anxious than ever. Perhaps what she was facing was not just a simple search, but a battle with forces she had never imagined. She decided to sit down and write down everything she had learned. The letters, Helen's diary, and the stories from Mr. Jackson all were pieces of a larger puzzle she needed to understand. The house was not just a home for the Thompson family. It was also a being that carried deep mysteries. As night fell, Ruth took out a piece of paper and began to write. The words flowed like a stream of thoughts constantly pouring from her mind. "The Thompson family has lived in fear, and now they need me. I must uncover the truth about this house and help them escape that presence," she wrote. She felt the need to act immediately. After thinking for a moment, she decided to learn about the history of the house. Perhaps she would find some evidence of the presence she was sensing. The next morning, Mrs. Ruth went to the town library. She found Mrs. Margaret organizing books. Mrs. Ruth approached her and asked, "Mrs. Margaret, could you tell me about the history of the Thompson house? I need to know more about what happened in the past." Mrs. Margaret looked at her with a concerned expression. "I have some documents in the archives. You might want to take a look at them," Mrs. Margaret replied, leading her to a small room inside the library. In the archives, the tall bookshelves were filled with documents, old newspapers, and photographs. Mrs. Ruth felt a surge of excitement as she began to search for information. The yellowed pages seemed to be waiting for her to discover them. Where to start, she wondered, flipping open an old notebook. The handwritten lines appeared, documenting the history of the house. The house was built in the 1800s and belonged to the Lockhart family, she read quietly. They were an affluent family, but faced many troubles. Many in the town believed they had to leave due to unexplained events. Curious, she continued searching. Another page spoke of a frightening incident that occurred in the 1920s. One of the Lockhart's family members vanished during a major storm. People rumored that she was dragged into the darkness, she read. Each page brought a heavy feeling to her. Is this the presence that Mrs. Clara sensed? She wondered. She kept flipping through the documents and eventually found an old newspaper article with a bold headline. The Haunted House. The Lockhart Family. She read each word carefully. Many have seen strange lights emanating from the house at night, and the laughter of children echoes in the silent space. Investigations found no clues about what happened to this family, and the house has been abandoned ever since. Her heart raced. What she had read felt like more than just urban legends. They were truths that had been forgotten over time. She felt she was getting closer to the truth she needed to uncover. After spending the entire morning at the library, Ruth stepped outside with a sense of fatigue, but also exhilaration. She needed to speak with those who had lived in the house. Perhaps they held valuable experiences she had yet to discover. Returning to her home, she decided to meet the neighbors living near the Thompson house. She knew they might have witnessed the strange occurrences that the Thompson family had endured. She began with the Miller family, who lived right next to the house. Ruth knocked on the door, and an elderly woman opened it. "Hello, I'm Ruth. I'd like to ask you about the Thompson family," she said, a flutter of excitement in her heart. "The Thompson family, they used to live there?" Mrs. Miller asked, her expression showing genuine concern. "Yes, they mysteriously disappeared, and I'm trying to find out what happened," Ruth replied. Mrs. Miller looked around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "I've heard stories about that house. There's something not quite right happening there. Many times, I've heard the laughter of children, but when I went to check, there was no one there," Mrs. Miller said, her voice revealing fear. "Do you know anything else?" Ruth asked, listening intently. "There was one time, during a heavy rain, I saw lights flickering in the house. I thought someone was living there, but I didn't see anyone. We had to leave our home for a long time because we couldn't stand it," Mrs. Miller said, her face filled with worry. Ruth felt her excitement grow. "Is there anything else you remember?" she continued to ask. "Just one thing. There have been screams at night, and many people in town believe that's a sign of something very evil," Mrs. Miller said. Ruth left Mrs. Miller's house, filled with unease. The stories she heard seemed to confirm what she had felt all along. The whispers, the strange lights, and the feeling of being watched all pointed to the fact that the house was anything but ordinary. She decided to continue meeting with other neighbors to uncover more about the mystery surrounding the house. She visited Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins, who lived not far away. Mr. Jenkins, a tall man with a serious expression, opened the door. "Hello, Mrs. Ruth. You're here to inquire about the Thompson family, aren't you?" he asked. "Yes. I want to know more about the house and what happened there," Ruth replied. ... Mr. Jenkins frowned and led her inside. "A lot has happened here. I've lived here my whole life and have seen many strange things. That place has been restless for years," he said. Ruth listened intently, feeling as if she was stepping into unknown territory. "Can you tell me about the strange things you've seen?" she asked. "One night, while I was sitting in the garden, I saw a dark shadow glide past the window. It was so fast that I couldn't identify what it was. But then I heard voices, like those of children, Mr. Jenkins said, his expression serious. That sounds terrifying. Do you know who lived in the house before the Thompson family? Ruth asked. Only that before them was the Lockhart family. They encountered some unpleasant events, and when the Thompsons moved in, I thought things might be different. But they weren't, Mr. Jenkins said, his gaze distant. Ruth felt her anxiety rise again. It seems this house has a dark history. Is there anything we can do to help the Thompson family? She asked. Perhaps you should look into the Lockhart family and what they went through. There might be a way to free the house from its troubles, Mr. Jenkins said, his voice lowering. Ruth thanked Mr. Jenkins and left their house, feeling increasingly trapped. She knew her journey was long and full of challenges, but she also understood that she couldn't give up. The Thompson family was waiting for her help, and she would not stop searching for the truth. As night fell, Ruth returned home. The fragments of her life were gradually forming a mysterious picture. The whispers, strange lights, and unforgettable memories all pointed her toward one final destination, the Thompson house. She silently vowed to herself that she would continue to fight for their peace. She took out Helen's diary and reread the pages she had written. There is something waiting for us here. She felt as if Helen's words were calling out to her. Ruth knew that her journey was just beginning, and she was ready to face the unknown. The strange things that might be hidden within the house she was determined to decode. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy, but Mrs. Ruth felt the atmosphere around her growing increasingly somber. She had returned to the Thompson house, filled with determination yet equally anxious. The stories she had heard from the neighbors, along with the information from the library, had ignited a fierce curiosity within her, yet also fear. She paused outside the house, a chill from the old bricks running down her spine. The house loomed large, with dark windows seemingly watching her every move. Taking a deep breath, she decided to step inside. Inside, the air was stifling, as if time had come to a standstill. Mrs. Ruth felt the walls concealing secrets that she had come to uncover. She walked through the living room, where the old sofas were covered in dust. She wondered if anyone had ever sat here and felt the presence of the lost souls. She made her way upstairs, where she felt the tension rising. The door leading to the master bedroom was tightly shut, and she couldn't resist the curiosity. She gently opened the door and stepped inside. The bedroom resembled a painting from the past, with faded curtains and a large bed in the center of the room. She touched the dusty blanket, feeling as if she were touching long-lost memories. I must find out what happened here, she told herself, as she began to search. She opened the old wardrobe, revealing dresses that had yellowed with time, seemingly still holding the scent of the past. She rummaged through it, hoping to find something that could help her understand more about the Thompson family and what they had endured. Among the items, she spotted a small box, a mysterious piece in the dark room. She opened the box to find several old photographs and a journal inside. The photos showed the Thompson family happily together, but the expressions in their eyes carried an inexplicable sadness. She flipped open the journal, feeling the aged pages that had been carefully preserved. May 15th, 1983, she read quietly. I feel that something is wrong in this house. There have been strange noises, as if someone is watching us. I can't share this with anyone, as they would think I'm crazy. A chill ran down Mrs. Ruth's spine. The words seemed to call out to her, revealing the fear that the Thompson family had endured. She continued reading and discovered that the following entries detailed increasingly bizarre events. The house began to exhibit strange phenomena. Lights flickered unexpectedly, and we often heard whispers at night. I am terrified, but no one in the family believes me. Mrs. Ruth felt her heart tighten. It seemed Helen had suffered her fear in solitude. She kept reading until a particular line made her pause. There is something in this house that does not want us to stay. I feel as if it is calling for us to leave. Her heart weighed heavy. Mrs. Ruth closed the journal, realizing that what she was facing was not merely a story. She had to do something to help the Thompson family. Perhaps uncovering the past was the key to freeing them. She decided she had to go back to see Mr. Jackson. The information he had shared earlier had been incredibly helpful, and perhaps he would know more about the strange phenomena she was experiencing. As she left the house, she felt as if an unseen force was pulling her back, as though the walls of the house were trying to hold her there. She drove to Mr. Jackson's home, her heart filled with emotion. She felt as if she was facing both the wondrous and the terrifying at the same time. She knocked on the door, and Mr. Jackson opened it, his expression serious. "Hello, Mrs. Ruth. Did you find anything?" he asked. "Yes, and I need your help." "What the Thompson family has been through is truly frightening," Mrs. Ruth replied, feeling the weight of her words. Mr. Jackson invited her inside and gestured for her to sit down. "Tell me, what did you discover?" he asked. Mrs. Ruth began to tell him about Helen's diary and the strange phenomena the Thompson family had experienced. As she spoke, Mr. Jackson's expression grew somber. "It seems what you found is not just an ordinary house. They faced things beyond imagination," he said. "Do you know how to resolve this situation?" Mrs. Ruth asked, a sense of hope rising within her. "There might be a way, but it will be very dangerous. You will need to connect with the lost souls," Mr. Jackson replied, his voice heavy. Mrs. Ruth felt a mix of fear and determination. "I am ready to do whatever it takes. The Thompson family needs me," she affirmed. "All right, but first you need to prepare yourself mentally. You will need a few items to help facilitate communication. A mirror, a candle, and some fresh flowers. These things will help create the right atmosphere for making contact," Mr. Jackson instructed. Mrs. Ruth thanked him and left his house with a heavy but hopeful heart. She knew she was on the path to uncovering things no one in town could imagine. Determined, she sought the truth and aimed to free the Thompson family from their horrors. Upon returning home, she began to prepare the necessary items. She found an old mirror, a candle from her mother's collection, and the fresh flowers she had bought earlier. Excitement coursed through her as she arranged them on the table. As night fell, the atmosphere grew somber. She lit the candle and placed the mirror in the center of the table. Closing her eyes, she focused on her thoughts about the Thompson family and what they had endured. She sensed a powerful energy emanating from the objects around her. "I must be strong," she reminded herself. "The Thompson family needs me. I can't let them suffer through this alone." Opening her eyes, she gazed into the mirror. In the flickering light of the candle, her reflection appeared hazy. It felt as if she was stepping into another realm, a space between two worlds. "Please tell me what happened to the Thompson family," she whispered, her heart filled with resolve. A gentle breeze swept through the room, and Mrs. Ruth felt shadows flitting by. Whispered sounds filled the air, and she sensed a power gradually materializing before her. She clenched her fists, determined not to give up. As she stared into the mirror, the images began to sharpen. A young woman appeared, her face etched with fear. "We tried, but we couldn't escape it," she whispered, her voice seemingly coming from the depths of the past. "Who are you?" Mrs. Ruth asked, striving to maintain her composure. "I am Helen, the mother of the Thompson family. We had to run from this, but it won't let go. The flashlight's beam was too weak to illuminate the entire space of the basement. Mrs. Ruth stepped forward, a chill invading her body, as if the air here was heavy and oppressive. The damp walls, the abandoned objects, and the dust made her feel as though she was entering another world. As Mrs. Ruth's foot touched the cold ground, the crunching sound of dust and dirt echoed, like the whispers of sleeping souls. She took a deep breath, trying to focus and dispel the fear rising within her. "Stay focused, Ruth," she told herself. "You need to find out what's going on." The basement was dark and mysterious, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Strange sounds, like the rustling of wind and distant cries, made her heart race. She swept the flashlight around, searching for any sign of the strange presence Helen had mentioned. When the light illuminated a dark corner, she spotted an old wooden box. Its surface was faded and seemed to have been forgotten for a long time. This must be the box Helen mentioned, she thought as she approached it. Carefully, she opened the lid. Inside was a small statue made of stone, but with an unusual, hard-to-identify shape. Upon seeing it, she felt a strange compulsion, as if it was beckoning her closer. But as soon as she touched the statue, a chill washed over her, and she immediately withdrew her hand. "Don't touch it," a voice echoed from the darkness. Mrs. Ruth turned around, her heart stopping. There was no one there, but the presence of something dark enveloped her. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am a part of what happened here," the voice replied. "You shouldn't be here. It won't stop." "But I need to uncover the truth," Mrs. Ruth insisted, trying to keep her fear at bay. "I have to save the Thompson family." "Save?" the voice scoffed. "They don't want to be saved. They are under its control. It cannot be stopped." Despite the ominous words, Mrs. Ruth felt a strong determination rising within her. She couldn't let herself be crushed by this fear. "I will find a way. I won't let this continue." As she continued examining the statue, she noticed strange symbols carved into its surface. They appeared to be ancient drawings, bizarre images that she couldn't comprehend. The flashlight illuminated every detail, but she felt as if they were shifting, as if the images were coming to life. "You can't simply look at it without knowing what happened," the voice continued. "Each symbol, each image holds a story, a tragic story." "What story?" Mrs. Ruth asked, both curious and anxious. "Is it the story of the Thompson family?" "Not just that. It's also the story of the souls trapped here. They traded their lives for freedom, but the price they paid was horrific." The voice grew stronger, as if rising from buried memories. Mrs. Ruth felt her heart sink as she imagined the tormented souls and what they had endured. "I want to help them," she said. "I can't let this continue. We have to find a way to free them." "Free?" The voice was filled with derision. "You don't know what you're up against. It's not that simple. If you choose to face it, you will pay the price." "I'm ready," Mrs. Ruth replied with determination. "I can't let fear take over my life. I have to confront it." "Very well, but remember, darkness never forgives easily. If you want to uncover the truth, follow my instructions," the voice warned. "You need to connect with the power of the statue. Only then will you understand what happened." Mrs. Ruth made her decision. "I will do that. I will find a way to connect with this power. I can't abandon these souls, especially Helen." For a moment, everything fell silent. She felt the air around her begin to tremble, and the statue seemed to emit a faint glow. Touch it again, but this time think of the trapped souls. Imagine what they desire, and the power of the statue will guide you. Taking a deep breath, She resolved not to let fear control her. She touched the statue once more, and immediately images flooded her mind. Scenes of tormented souls trapped in endless darkness, pain, and despair filling their hearts. The light from the statue seemed to grow stronger, and she felt herself being pulled into another world. She could hear calls from afar, dissonant sounds, and mournful cries. "We are here," a voice echoed in her mind. "Help us." Mrs. Ruth closed her eyes, her heart racing. "I will help you," she whispered. "I won't leave you alone. Do you have the strength to face the darkness?" The voice inquired. "I will not give up," she replied resolutely. "I will find a way to assist you, even if it means confronting my greatest fears." When she opened her eyes, a blinding light enveloped the statue, and she felt a powerful connection forming between them. "You are ready. Continue, and hold tightly to what you have discovered." The voice became weaker, yet remained firm. "Thank you," Mrs. Ruth said, her heart swelling with emotion. "I will not forget what you've taught me. I will return to help you." She withdrew her hand from the statue, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She knew she had embarked on a new path, one where light and darkness would intertwine, and she would never be alone in this fight. With a strong will, she decided to return to the Thompson family, where the real battle awaited. She was prepared to face whatever lay ahead. She could not let darkness claim innocent lives. As she stepped out of the basement, hope and determination filled her heart. The story of Helen and the Thompson family had only just begun, and she would not stop until they were free. "Helen, right?" Mrs. Roos asked, her voice filled with anticipation and empathy. What she had just witnessed in the mirror felt like a door opening to the past, and she felt as if she were very close to the truth. "Yes, I am Helen," the woman in the mirror confirmed, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I have been here too long, unable to leave this place. My family, they don't know what to do to escape it." Mrs. Ruth swallowed hard, feeling her heart tighten at those words. "Can you tell me what happened? Why did your family have to endure such terrible things?" Helen lowered her head, as if unable to bear the intensity of Mrs. Ruth's gaze. "It started with something normal. We bought this house with the hope of a fresh, happy life. But as soon as we moved in, strange things began to happen." "Strange things?" Mrs. Ruth asked urgently, feeling a rising thrill in her heart. "Yes, strange noises at night, shadows drifting through the rooms. We tried to find reasons, but it seemed like everything only got worse. I felt like something was haunting my family, and none of us could voice our fears," Helen said, her voice choking with emotion. "I kept a journal to document what was happening, but no one believed me. They thought I was just a weak woman." Mrs. Ruth felt her heart ache at Helen's suffering. "Have you tried to find a way to escape it?" "We tried. But everything we did only made things worse. In the end, I had to leave my family. I thought if I left, it would end. But I was wrong," Helen sobbed. "It didn't just come for me. It took everything I loved." Mrs. Ruth realized that Helen's presence in the mirror was not just that of a tormented soul, but of a loving mother, a woman who had fought desperately to protect her family. "I want to help you, Helen. I want to free your family," she said with determination. "In the basement," Helen replied. "It's where we found a strange box. It looks like a statue, but there's something wrong with it. We felt its power the very first time we touched it." Mrs. Ruth shivered. The basement, that was a place she had never dared to set foot in. What Helen said only heightened her anxiety. "I need to go down there," she declared with determination. "However, be careful," Helen warned. "It's not just a box. It can manifest things you cannot imagine. If you go there, make sure you have the strength to face it. Don't let yourself be drawn into the darkness. Mrs. Ruth felt a chill run down her spine, but she knew she couldn't back down. I will do whatever it takes. Please help me, she whispered, her voice steady. You need a way to connect with me. Light a candle in the basement and think of me. We can help each other. But remember, you are not alone, Helen said, and her image began to fade in the mirror. Mrs. Ruth felt a powerful emotion swell within her. She was connected to a soul, and now her responsibility was not only to confront the fears of the Thompson family, but also to save Helen's spirit. After extinguishing the candle, she placed the mirror down on the table, determined to head to the basement. She stepped into the dark hallway, her courage slowly returning as she recalled Helen's words. The basement was a place she had never dared to enter, but the curiosity and the command from the spirit drove her forward, making it impossible to turn back. She approached the door leading down to the basement, her hand trembling as she opened it. The musty smell filled her nose, and the light from the candle barely illuminated the path. The stairs creaked beneath her feet as she slowly descended, a cold sensation enveloping her. When she reached the bottom, a vast space unfolded before her. Abandoned objects lay scattered about, dust covering everything. In the middle of the room, she saw a large wooden box, intricately carved but worn down by time. Her heart raced as she approached. This was the object Helen had mentioned. Cautiously, she opened the lid of the box. Inside lay a small statue, its shape vague and difficult to discern. A heavy feeling immediately washed over her. She felt as if someone was staring at her, not just from the statue, but also from the darkness surrounding her. Be careful, a voice echoed from the shadows. Mrs. Ruth turned round, her heart pounding. There was no one there, but the sense of a presence made her uneasy. She turned back to the statue, trying not to let fear take control. I'm not afraid, she told herself, lighting a candle before the statue, the flickering light enveloping the space. Closing her eyes, she focused on connecting with Helen. Helen, come to me, she whispered, her heart filled with determination. We will free your family together. A cold wind blew through, and the light from the candle seemed to grow stronger. She felt a surge of power from the statue, and Helen's image reappeared in her mind. Thank you for coming, Helen's voice echoed. Are you ready? Mrs. Ruth asked, sensing a shift in the space around her. I am ready, but you must prepare for what is to come, Helen warned. It won't be easy, and what you find may force you to confront your greatest fears. Mrs. Ruth felt herself being pulled into another realm, where light and darkness intertwined. I will not back down, she asserted, feeling her heart swell with strength. Hold on to the candle, and don't let the light go out, Helen said, as images began to swirl around her. We need to uncover this secret, but be cautious of what you see. Mrs. Ruth looked around, seeing the hazy images swirling by scenes of the Thompson family, filled with smiles and tears, fear and hope. She knew that what she was about to uncover could change everything. Let's free these things together, she whispered. We will make it end. As the light from the candle illuminated the space, she felt Helen's presence beside her. She knew she was not alone, and this journey was only just beginning. The next morning, Mrs. Ruth woke up with a heavy heart. The feeling of anxiety seemed to pour into her mind without end. Although she had made significant progress in understanding what was happening to the Thompson family and the trapped souls, the presence of darkness loomed like a constant threat. The next morning, Mrs. Ruth woke up with a heavy heart. The feeling of anxiety seemed to pour into her mind without end. Although she had made significant progress in understanding what was happening to the Thompson family and the trapped souls, the presence of darkness loomed like a constant threat. As she entered the house, the atmosphere felt as heavy as before. She could sense the fear lingering in the air, but now she also felt a renewed strength swelling within her. "I can't let you live in this fear," she reminded herself. "I won't give up." Helen was standing by the window, gazing outside. As Mrs. Ruth approached, Helen turned with a distant look in her eyes, as if she was somewhere far away. "Mrs. Ruth," she whispered, "I feel like something is about to happen." "That's right, Helen. We need to prepare." "You won't have to face this alone anymore," Mrs. Ruth affirmed. Helen felt a warmth in her heart at Mrs. Ruth's support. "I know, but I'm afraid what we're about to do will make things worse." "No, we will make it better," Mrs. Ruth replied, her determination clear in her voice. "Remember that the power of love and unity can overcome any darkness." Both of them decided to investigate the strange statue that Mrs. Ruth had discovered in the basement. She brought the statue along, believing it held the necessary power to help the Thompson family break free from the enveloping darkness. "Let's place the statue in the center of the living room," Mrs. Ruth suggested. "We'll form a circle around it and connect our energies together." Helen nodded, and they immediately began rearranging the furniture in the living room, clearing a space to create a circle. They gathered the spiritual items they had collected, such as candles, holy water, and gemstones that Mrs. Ruth believed could enhance their energy. As everything was set, Mrs. Ruth stood at the center of the circle, tightly gripping the statue in her hands. "Close your eyes and take a deep breath," she said. "We will together send thoughts of love and strength to the trapped souls." Both of them shut their eyes, and Mrs. Ruth began to softly whisper an incantation she had researched. "Lost souls, hear our plea. We are here to help you. Return to the light and find your peace." With each word she spoke, the light from the statue seemed to grow stronger, and a gentle breeze began to flow through the room. The candles burned brightly, as if responding to their prayer. "It feels incredible," Helen said, with her eyes still closed. "As if someone is listening to us." "Yes," Mrs. Ruth replied, her heart filled with hope. "Let's continue to send our energy and love outward." Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room changed. The light from the statue began to emit brilliant rays, forming strange shapes in the air. Mrs. Ruth felt a powerful flow of energy connecting them to the souls. "Show us where you are," Mrs. Ruth called out, feeling a great strength within her. "Tell us what you need." The light from the statue grew brighter than ever, and the images in the air became clearer. The faces of the trapped souls appeared, pleading for freedom. "Let us out," another voice echoed. "We don't want to be here anymore. We will free you," Mrs. Ruth said, filled with determination. "Focus your energy on the statue, and together we will defeat the darkness." Both of them concentrated all their strength into the statue. Mrs. Ruth felt the connection between them growing stronger. All fears seemed to dissipate, leaving only a profound sense of hope. Suddenly, the space around them began to tremble. A strong wind rushed into the room, extinguishing the candles and scattering everything. "No," Mrs. Ruth shouted, struggling to hold on to the statue. "We can't let the darkness win." The voice from the shadows spoke, cold and threatening. "You will not succeed. I will not allow you to free them." Helen trembled, but Mrs. Ruth felt her resolve strengthen. "We can. We will not let the darkness stop us." They focused all their strength, trying to connect with the souls calling out to them. "Come to us," Mrs. Ruth exclaimed. "Break free from these chains." Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the statue. dispelling the darkness around them. The images of the souls began to detach from the air, rising like bright, luminous clouds. Mrs. Ruth and Helen felt their strength merging with the souls, forming a powerful embrace. "We can do it," Helen shouted, filled with joy. "We can set them free." A loud explosion rang out, and the light from the statue surged stronger than ever. Mrs. Ruth felt as if she was soaring, along with the liberated souls. A sense of freedom and peace filled her soul. As the darkness gradually faded, the atmosphere in the room became warm and refreshing. Mrs. Ruth opened her eyes, and the souls had vanished, leaving only brilliant light. "We did it," she exclaimed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Helen also couldn't hold back her tears. "We helped them find peace," she said, her heart filled with joy. Mrs. Ruth embraced Helen, both realizing that they had created a significant change. They had not only liberated the souls, but also found strength within themselves. Love and courage had triumphed. "I don't know what will happen next," Mrs. Ruth said, "but we will never forget what we've been through." Helen nodded, her eyes filled with faith. "We will continue to help those in need, no matter what happens." With hearts full of hope, they decided to leave the house where painful memories had taken place. They walked outside, leaving the darkness behind, with the brilliant light guiding them toward a new, promising future.